The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Linden Voss finally ran out of time. She had known it was coming. The fever had started 4 nights ago. A dull throb behind her eyes that she'd written off as dehydration, then exhaustion, then stubbornness. She was good at stubborn. 12 years in the Navy had made sure of that. But by the 3rd morning, when she tried to climb down from the loft to feed Colt, and found her legs had decided they belonged to someone else, she understood that this was different. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road that the county maps didn't bother naming. It was 11 miles from the nearest town, 14 from the nearest hospital, and exactly as far from other people as Linden had wanted it to be when she'd signed the lease 18 months ago. She'd paid 6 months in advance, cash, and the landlord, a retired rancher named something she'd already forgotten, had been so grateful he hadn't asked a single question. That was the deal. That was always the deal. Outside, the pines disappeared into low grey cloud. The Cascade foothills in November were nothing like the recruitment posters. They were wet and dark and indifferent, and Linden had loved them for it. From the first morning, she'd driven up that unnamed road and understood that nobody would find her here unless she let them. Colt was whining. He'd been doing it since yesterday, standing at the foot of the loft ladder with his ears flat and his pale eyes tracking her every move. He was a Belgian Malinois, 4 years old, with a scar across his left shoulder from a wire fence in Kandahar that had healed crooked and white. He had belonged to Petty Officer First Class Aaron Breck before he'd belonged to her, and there were days she still caught Colt staring at the door with the particular stillness of an animal, waiting for someone who was never going to come through it. She understood that. She did not say it out loud. "I'm fine," she told him. Colt stared at her. He was not persuaded. The truth was that she hadn't eaten in 36 hours, and the water she'd been drinking tasted like metal, and when she'd pressed 2 fingers to her wrist that morning, the pulse had been wrong. Too fast, too shallow, skipping in a way that scared her, in a way that very little scared her anymore. She'd been in 2 overseas deployments, 1 vehicle rollover, and a night in Djibouti she had never discussed with anyone. She knew the difference between the kind of pain you worked through and the kind of pain that was telling you something. This was the second kind. She made it down the ladder by going 1 rung at a time, stopping twice to wait for the spinning to slow. Colt pressed his flank against her leg the whole way, solid and warm, and she gripped his harness without meaning to, and didn't let go until her boots were on the floor. Her truck was a Euro 9 Tacoma, dark green, with a dent in the passenger door and a crack in the windshield she kept telling herself she'd get fixed. The keys were on the hook by the door. She put on her jacket. She had to sit on the bench to do it, which was not something she acknowledged, and clipped Colt's lead and opened the door. The cold hit her like a flat hand. Colt walked beside her to the truck. He jumped in when she opened the passenger door, settled himself on the seat, and watched her walk around to the driver's side with the steady attention of something that understood more than it was supposed to. Linden sat behind the wheel and gripped it and breathed. 11 miles. She'd driven worse. She'd driven worse bleeding in the dark, with someone shouting in her earpiece and 3 different things on fire. She started the truck. The emergency room in Tallow Creek was not large. It had 12 beds, 2 trauma bays, and a waiting room with plastic chairs in a color that might once have been green. At 9:30 on a Wednesday night in November, it was quiet enough that the intake nurse heard the truck pull in and was already moving toward the door when Linden pushed through it. The nurse's name tag said Orin Sabel, RN. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, heavyset, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the particular unhurried energy of someone who had seen a lot of things come through emergency room doors and learned not to be surprised by any of them. He looked at Linden. He looked at Colt, who had walked through the door at her left knee without anyone stopping him. He looked back at Linden. "How long?" he said. 3 days, she said. "Maybe 4. Sit down before you fall down." She sat. It was less of a choice than it looked. What happened after that had the quality of things that happen when your body has decided to stop waiting for your permission. Someone took her temperature, someone else asked her name, and she gave it, and they wrote it down and asked for insurance, and she gave that too. The lights were too bright. Colt sat on her feet when the triage nurse, a young woman with her hair in a bun who introduced herself as Della and seemed unfazed by the dog, tried to take Linden's blood pressure. Colt raised his head and showed his teeth. Just slightly, just enough. Della stopped. "It's okay," Linden said. Her voice came out flat, like she was reading from a card. He's working. He's okay, you can." She said something to Colt. One word, low, in a register that wasn't quite a command, and wasn't quite a request. Something between the two. Della watched the dog's ears come forward, watched his head drop back down, watched the tension leave his body the way water leaves a cloth when you wring it. "Okay," Della said quietly. She took the blood pressure. She wrote the numbers down, and her face did the thing faces do when the numbers are bad and you're trying not to show it. "I'm going to get Dr. Navarro. The dog stays," Linden said. "I know," Della said. Dr. Petra Navarro was the attending that night. She was small and quick-moving, and she had the kind of dark eyes that looked at you, like they were reading something written on the back of your skull. She came into the bay, looked at the chart Della handed her, looked at Linden, and pulled up a stool. "Tell me about the fever," she said. "Started 4 days ago. Before that. Any injury, any procedure, any cuts or punctures you let go too long?" Linden was quiet for a moment. There was a cut on her left forearm, thin and short, from where she'd caught the fence wire last week pulling Colt back from a deer trail. She'd cleaned it. She'd been sure she'd cleaned it. "Forearm," she said. Dr. Navarro looked. She didn't say anything for a moment. "What's your pain level?" 5. "Right. Maybe 6. You drove yourself 11 miles with a 6. "Yes." Dr. Navarro looked at her for a moment, with an expression that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite exasperation. Something that had learned to coexist with both. "You were military," she said. It wasn't a question. "Navy. 12 years. When'd you get out?" 18 months ago. "And you've been up that road ever since?" Linden didn't answer. Colt pressed his nose against her knee. "We're going to run blood cultures," Dr. Navarro said, standing. "I want a CBC, a metabolic panel, and I want to get you on IV fluids right now because you are significantly dehydrated, and that's making everything else worse. The cut on your arm concerns me. I'm not going to scare you yet, but I need you to stay here and let us do our jobs. Can you do that?" "The dog stays," Dr. Navarro said. "I already know." She left. Della came in with an IV kit, and this time when she reached for Linden's arm, Colt watched but didn't move. He lay down on the floor beside the bed, with his chin on his paws and his pale eyes on the curtain. The IV went in. The fluid started. Linden looked at the ceiling and focused on breathing. The blood cultures confirmed it by midnight. Sepsis. Early stage. Bacterial tracking from the forearm wound. Dr. Navarro came back in with the results and sat on the stool again in the way she sat when the news required sitting down for. "You got here in time," she said. "That's the first thing I want you to know. We caught this early enough that we're going to treat it aggressively, and you are going to be fine. But you need to be here for at least 48 hours on IV antibiotics, and I need you to not fight me on this." Linden was staring at the ceiling. 48 hours, minimum. The dog needs to go out. We'll figure that out." "There's no one." She stopped, swallowed. "There's no one I can call." Dr. Navarro looked at her with those reading glasses eyes and said nothing for a moment. The machines beeped. The hallway outside the curtain was quiet except for the sound of wheels on linoleum and someone talking in a low voice 2 bays over. "I'll ask Orin," she said. "He has a soft spot. Don't tell him I told you." She left. Linden closed her eyes. She thought about Aaron. She didn't mean to, but she always did, in the moments she stopped moving long enough for the thought to reach her. Aaron Breck, who had been her spotter for 2 years, and her friend for 3, who had known things about her, that she had never said out loud, the way people who work that close together come to know things, who had been 29 years old and engaged to a woman named. She always remembered the name. She couldn't stop remembering the name, Hadley, who had been killed by a landmine on a road outside Marjar that they had both walked a dozen times before, on a morning that had been clear and cold, and that Linden had decided, in the first few minutes of her shift, was going to be a quiet day. She had said that. She remembered saying it, "Looks quiet today," and Aaron had said, "Don't jinx it, Voss," and grinned at her over his coffee, and 2 hours later he was gone. She had been the one to tell Colt. That was the part that undid her still, when she let herself think about it. Not the memorial service, not the folded flag, not the flight home, sitting next to Colt in his military transport kennel, with her hand pressed flat against the wire door because he wouldn't stop crying, and she didn't know what else to do. It was the moment before all of that, the moment when she'd knelt down in the dirt beside the dog and looked at him and said, "He's gone, Colt," and watched the animal understand something she hadn't fully understood yet herself. Colt had been Aaron's. Aaron had found him in the military working dog program and bonded with him the way handlers sometimes bond with their dogs, completely, irrationally, past the point of professional distance. After the mission, when the question of what happened to the dog came up, there had been a lot of conversations that Linden hadn't been part of. She'd made herself part of them. She'd made it her problem. She'd pushed paperwork and called people above her pay grade and collected favors she'd been storing up for 3 years, and at the end of it, she'd brought Colt home. She didn't know if that made it better or worse. She didn't know what she was trying to fix. She did know that she was not going to leave him in a county shelter for 48 hours, because she'd gotten careless with a fence wire, and she'd clenched her jaw around that thought like it was something solid. Orrin came in at 1 in the morning to take Colt out to the parking lot. He came back 10 minutes later with the dog at his heel and a look on his face that said he had not expected to like the experience as much as he had. "He's a good boy," Orrin said, with the slightly defensive tone of a man who did not want to be caught saying that. "He's the best," Linden said. Colt jumped back up to his place, by her feet, and settled. Orrin checked the IV line and the monitors without being asked. He had the easy movements of someone who'd been doing the same work for a long time and had long since stopped needing to think about the mechanics of it. "You were Navy," he said. "MWD handler," she said. "It was the short version, military working dogs. You were with him overseas?" "No, he was. He belonged to someone else first." Orrin was quiet for a moment, adjusting the drip. What happened to the someone else? He didn't come home. Orrin nodded slowly. He didn't say he was sorry, which she appreciated. People who said they were sorry never knew what to do after they said it. "So you took the dog?" "I took the dog. That's a good thing you did," Orrin said. "I don't know what I did," Linden said. "I'm still figuring it out." Orrin turned off the overhead light on his way out and left the softer bedside lamp on, and Linden lay in the dim room with the sound of rain against the windows and Colt breathing at her feet, and she thought about the road up to her cabin and how long it had taken her to find something that felt like stillness, and whether stillness and peace were the same thing or just 2 words for the same habit of avoidance. She didn't have an answer. She closed her eyes. The next morning, she woke to Colt standing at full attention at the foot of the bed. Not aggressive, not growling, just still, the specific stillness that meant someone was nearby who he hadn't yet categorized. His ears were forward, his tail was low and straight. A woman stood in the gap in the curtain. She was in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back and the kind of posture that came from years of trying to take up less space. She was wearing a civilian jacket over her scrubs, which meant she wasn't on shift, which meant she'd come in specifically. She was holding a paper cup of coffee in each hand, and she was looking at Colt the way people sometimes look at things they weren't expecting to love. "I knocked," she said, "on the curtain. I know that doesn't make a lot of sense, but it seemed like the right thing to do. Linden pushed herself up on one elbow, her arm pulled against the IV line. "Who are you?" "My name is Sia Breck," the woman said. She said it the way people with unusual names say them. Preemptively, like she was bracing for the question. "Sia Shah. I know it's early, and I know you don't know me. I work the night shift here. I'm a respiratory therapist, and Orin told me you were here because I asked him, and I probably shouldn't have. Patient privacy, I know, but..." She stopped, took a breath, looked at Colt. "He texted me a photo of the dog. From last night. He said he didn't know why. It just seemed like... I don't know. He said it seemed like I should know." Linden was watching her. Her brain was still slow from the fever and the antibiotics, but something was moving in it. Some recognition that she couldn't fully form yet, working its way up to the surface the way objects do when they're coming up from deep water. "Breck," she said. The woman's jaw moved. "Aaron was my brother." The room was very quiet for a moment. Outside, someone walked past in the hall. The monitor beeped. Colt took one step toward the woman at the curtain, then another. He stopped 3 feet away from her and stood there, and his nose worked, and something in the line of his body changed, something unclenched. "He used to call me," Sayusi said, and her voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of someone who had practiced. "Every other Sunday. He'd call and I'd ask how the dog was before I asked how he was, and he'd give me grief about it, and he'd tell me some dumb story about something Colt had done that week that he thought was hilarious, and I'd always..." She stopped, looked down at the dog. "I'd always say, 'How's my boy?' That was my question. Every call. 'How's my boy?' She said the last 2 words the same way she'd been saying them for years, the same way, the same register, a thing worn smooth from use. Colt sat down, not the trained sit, not sharp and immediate and precise. A slow sit, like his legs had decided on their own. He looked at Sayusi with his pale eyes, and he made a sound low in his chest that was not a growl, and was not a whine, that was something older and stranger than either of those, and his tail moved once carefully, like he wasn't sure yet if it was allowed. Linden found that she could not speak. Sayusi set both cups of coffee down on the small table by the wall. She sat down on the floor, right there on the linoleum, without asking, without explaining, without looking at Linden at all. She sat cross-legged on the floor, and she held out one hand, and Colt walked the last 3 feet and put his head in her palm, and held it there. Sayusi closed her eyes. Her throat worked. She kept her face steady by what looked like considerable effort. "Hi, baby," she whispered. Linden pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth and looked at the ceiling and did not say anything. They sat like that for a long time. Nobody spoke. The rain moved against the windows. The machines kept their steady, indifferent count. Eventually, Colt lay down with his head in Sayusi's lap, and Sayusi looked up at Linden with her eyes wet, and her expression something that Linden didn't have a word for. Relief, maybe, or grief, or the strange overlap of the two that comes when something you've been carrying finally touches down somewhere solid. "I tried to find out what happened to him," Sayusi said. "After Aaron. Tried to find out where Colt had gone. They told me the dog had been... rehomed was the word they used. That it was classified, practically. I kept thinking about him being in some kennel somewhere, not understanding." She stopped. "I took him," Linden said. Her voice was rougher than she meant it to be. "Right after, I called everyone I could call, and I pulled everything I had, and I brought him home." Sayusi looked at her. "Why, because Aaron told me to." Not in those words. But he talked about Colt the way people talk about family. The dog knew things about your brother that I didn't know. The dog knew things about him that died with him, otherwise." She paused. "I don't know if that makes sense." "It makes sense," Sayusi said quietly. "I didn't know about you," Linden said. "I knew he had a sister. He talked about you. He said you'd argue about movies for hours, and he always lost. He said you made the best green child stew he'd ever had, and he talked about it like it was a legitimate military objective." Sayusi made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Almost. He talked about the dog more," Linden said. But he talked about you too. I want you to know that. Sawirse nodded. Her hand was moving in slow circles on Colt's head, the automatic motion of someone who had learned to comfort and been so good at it. The habit had become the shape of their hands. How long have you been up in those mountains? She asked. 18 months, by yourself. Yes. Sawirse looked at her for a moment. The way Dr. Navarro had looked at her, that particular kind of seeing that happens in places where people come when things are very wrong. You blame yourself, she said. It wasn't a question. Linden looked at the wall. I was the senior operator that morning. I made the call. We'd walked that road a dozen times, and I said. She stopped. The sentence had too many edges. I said it looked like a quiet day. And he said, don't jinx it, Sayose said. Linden's head turned. He told me about that, the way you two were with each other. He said you were the most careful person he'd ever worked with, and also somehow the most likely to say something that would tempt fate. A pause. He loved working with you. I know, Linden said. That makes it harder. I know, Sayose said. I know it does. Outside, the rain shifted, lighter now, the heavy grey breaking into something that let the morning through. It wasn't sun, exactly, but it was the idea of sun, the light behind the clouds suggesting that the clouds were not permanent, that they were just a condition, just weather, just a thing that moved. Sayose stayed for 2 hours. She brought Colt out to the small courtyard behind the ER twice because she'd watched the schedule and knew who was on break and when. She brought Linden a second cup of coffee because the first one had gone cold. And she sat in the chair they'd moved in from the waiting room, and they talked about Aaron, not the mission, not the road, not the landmine. They talked about the way he laughed at his own jokes, which was apparently both his best and worst quality. They talked about a camping trip to the Gemmes Mountains when they were kids, and how he'd gotten poison ivy on 90% of his body and had refused to admit it for 3 days. They talked about the green child stew, and Sayose promised at some point to send the recipe, and Linden said she didn't cook much, and Sayose said that wasn't a medical condition, that was a choice, and for the first time in a very long time, Linden laughed. It was small. It was short. It came out rusty, like something that had been closed up for too long, but it was real. Dr. Navarro discharged her Thursday afternoon. The antibiotics had knocked the infection back hard and fast. Caught early enough, she said again, which Linden understood now was Dr. Navarro's way of saying this could have gone very differently if you'd waited 1 more day. She sent Linden home with 2 weeks of oral antibiotics and a wound care kit and a piece of paper with a number on it, and the words, "Please consider calling this," written in neat handwriting. Linden looked at the paper. It's a therapist, Dr. Navarro said. She works with veterans. She's very good and she doesn't push. I'm fine, Linden said. I know you are, Dr. Navarro said. You're also living alone at the end of a dirt road with a fever of 103 and no one to call. Those 2 things can both be true. Linden folded the paper and put it in her jacket pocket. Sayose was waiting in the parking lot. She'd offered to follow Linden home, not intrusively, just quietly, in the way she seemed to do things, making herself available without making it a demand. She stood by her car with Colt on a borrowed lead, the dog sitting calmly at her heel as if he'd known her for years, which, in the ways that mattered, he had. You don't have to, Linden said. I know, Sayose said. But it's a long road, and your truck has a cracked windshield, and you've been on IV antibiotics for 36 hours. Humor me. Linden looked at her. She thought about the cabin. She thought about the 11 miles of unnamed road, and the logs of it and the pines going up into the cloud, and the loft, and the ladder, and the way Colt had pressed against her leg all the way down because he knew she needed it. There's a gas station in town that makes decent coffee, she said finally. If you want to stop on the way. Sayose smiled. It was the first full smile Linden had seen from her. Not the careful almost smiles from the morning, but a real one, a little unguarded, a little surprised at itself. Yeah, she said. I want to stop. They drove up the mountain in convoy, Linden's Tacoma ahead with its cracked windshield and its dented door, Sawyer's Subaru behind with its headlights on against the afternoon gray. Colt sat in the passenger seat and watched the trees go by with calm, deliberate attention, the way he watched everything he considered his to protect. The cabin came into view through the pines and Linden parked and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. She thought about the morning she'd driven up here for the first time, what she'd been looking for. Stillness, she'd told herself. Distance. The specific quiet of a place where nothing was expected of her, and she wasn't responsible for anything except the dog and the firewood. And the next day, she'd found it. She'd been sure that was what she needed. She didn't know if she still believed that. She didn't know what she believed, exactly, except that there was a woman getting out of a Subaru in her driveway, who had sat on a hospital floor and said hi, baby, to a dog who had spent 3 years waiting to hear it, and that this felt like something. She didn't have a word for what it felt like. She didn't need one yet. Colt jumped down from the truck and walked to Sarse and sat beside her in the wet pine needles, and Sarse put her hand on his head, and the three of them stood in the cold outside the cabin in the November gray, and Linden looked at them and understood, for the first time in 18 months, that she had brought the right thing home. She hadn't known, when she'd pulled all those favors and pushed all that paperwork, what she was really doing. She'd thought she was making it right. She'd thought she was carrying Aaron's dog home because somebody had to, and she was the one who'd been there, and it was, at minimum, the last useful thing she could do. But Colt hadn't just been carrying Aaron's memory. He'd been carrying something that linked Linden to a world she'd cut herself off from, a thread, thin and patient, that had been waiting for the right hands to follow it back, and the hands had known the word. "You coming in?" Linden asked. "Yes," Sarse said. "I'm coming in." The door of the cabin opened. The dog went first, then Sayerse, then Linden last, pausing in the doorway to look back at the wet pines and the grey sky and the unnamed road going down the mountain toward the town and the hospital and the life she hadn't been living. She'd call the therapist. She didn't decide it exactly. It arrived. The way decisions sometimes do when they've been made quietly somewhere underneath all your resistance, when your body has already turned in the direction you needed to go. She'd call the number on the folded piece of paper, and she'd say she was a veteran, and she'd been alone for 1.5 years, and she was fine, and the therapist would probably hear the space between those two things and know exactly what to do with it. She'd call. Not today, but soon. She went inside. She closed the door. The standoff was over.